For over 4 decades, one man held absolute power over an entire nation, and used it in ways that most people still don't fully know about. His name became synonymous with terror and control, and yet, the full picture has never been told in one place. Until now. In September 1969, Libya was a kingdom. King Idris I had ruled since the country gained independence in 1951, and for most Libyans, the political landscape had remained relatively stable, at least on the surface. Then, on September 1st, 1969, a group of military officers launched a bloodless coup while the king was abroad receiving medical treatment in Turkey. Within hours, the government had collapsed. The officers, young, ambitious, and ideologically charged, dissolved the monarchy and announced the birth of the Libyan Arab Republic. At the center of this coup was a 27-year-old army officer named Muammar Gaddafi. He was not the most senior officer involved, nor the most decorated, but he had the vision, the drive, and the ruthlessness to position himself as the undisputed leader almost immediately after the dust settled. Gaddafi was born in 1942 in a tent in the Libyan desert near the town of Sirte. His family were Bedouins, nomadic people with no fixed address and very little material wealth. He grew up watching Italian colonial forces occupy his country, and then watching the British and Americans set up military bases under the post-war arrangement with King Idris. From a young age, he harbored a deep resentment toward foreign powers, and a passionate, almost messianic belief in Arab unity and pan-Arab nationalism, ideas largely inspired by Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. After the coup, Gaddafi moved quickly. He expelled American and British military personnel from Libyan soil, nationalized foreign oil companies, and declared Libya's oil wealth the property of its people. For many Libyans, these early moves felt like liberation. Oil revenues surged, public housing was built, literacy rates improved, and for the first time, ordinary Libyan families had access to healthcare and education that had been out of reach under the monarchy. But even in those early years, there were signs of what was coming. Gaddafi did not tolerate dissent. Political parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved. A system of revolutionary committees was established, groups of loyalists embedded throughout Libyan society whose job was to identify, report, and suppress anyone who questioned the regime. By the mid-1970s, Gaddafi had published what he called the Green Book, a sprawling ideological manifesto that rejected both capitalism and communism and laid out his vision for a so-called Third Universal Theory, a form of direct democracy that, in practice, gave all power to him. He called his system of governance the Jamahiriya, a word he invented, roughly translated as state of the masses. In reality, it was a totalitarian system dressed up in revolutionary language. To reinforce his grip, Gaddafi systematically dismantled every institution that could have formed a counterweight to his authority. The judiciary was brought under regime control. The military was purged of officers whose loyalty was in doubt. Universities were placed under the supervision of revolutionary committees. Even mosques were monitored. Religious scholars who deviated from officially sanctioned interpretations of Islam were removed or imprisoned. The country's entire civic infrastructure, every layer of it, was reshaped to serve one purpose: the perpetuation of Gaddafi's rule. What made this particularly effective and particularly suffocating was the way it reached into ordinary life. A neighbor could report a neighbor. A student could be denounced by a classmate. Suspicion became the default currency of social interaction, and trust, between friends, between colleagues, even within families, became a dangerous luxury. And as the 1970s progressed, the mask began to slip, and what lay beneath it was far darker than anyone had anticipated. To understand what Gaddafi did to the Libyan people, you have to understand how fear functioned as the primary tool of governance. The revolutionary committees were everywhere. They operated inside factories, universities, government offices, and neighborhoods. Their mandate was simple: monitor the population, identify enemies of the revolution, and eliminate them. The definition of enemy was broad enough to encompass almost anyone: a professor who expressed skepticism about the Green Book, a student who had been overheard criticizing the government, a journalist who asked the wrong question. People disappeared. That is not a metaphor. Men, women, and in some cases teenagers, were taken from their homes in the middle of the night and never seen again by their families. The secret police, known by several names over the years, but most commonly referred to as the Mukhabarat, operated with complete impunity. There were no warrants, no trials, no legal processes. A phone call was enough to have someone removed from their life. One of the most feared locations in all of Libya was Abu Salim prison in Tripoli. Opened in 1984, it became the primary destination for political prisoners, people who had been arrested not for committing crimes, but for holding opinions, belonging to the wrong family, or in some cases, simply knowing the wrong person. Conditions inside Abu Salim were documented in harrowing detail by survivors and human rights organizations. Prisoners were held in extreme overcrowding, denied adequate food and water, cut off entirely from their families, and subjected to prolonged periods of solitary confinement. But the worst chapter of Abu Salim's history came in June 1996, and it stands as one of the most documented atrocities of the Gaddafi era. In the summer of 1996, prisoners at Abu Salim staged a protest over their conditions. The lack of food, the absence of any legal process, and the complete blackout of communication with their families. Guards responded with force. And then, on June 29, 1996, over a period of approximately 12 hours, security forces moved through the prison and carried out mass killings of the inmates. The exact number of those killed has been debated, but Libyan human rights organizations and Amnesty International concluded that approximately 1,200 prisoners were killed that day. Their bodies were buried in mass graves on the outskirts of Tripoli. Their families were told nothing. For years, the Libyan government refused to acknowledge the massacre had taken place. Families of the disappeared continued to gather outside the prison gates for years afterward, bringing food parcels for loved ones who, unknown to them, were already dead. It was only after 2001, when some families began receiving death certificates, that the scale of what had happened started to emerge. The Abu Salim massacre was not an isolated incident. It was the most visible expression of a system of repression that had been operating for decades. A system Gaddafi had personally constructed, supervised, and protected. And while that system was grinding people up inside Libya's prisons, Gaddafi was extending his reach far beyond his borders. Gaddafi was not content to terrorize only those within Libya's borders. Starting in the early 1970s and intensifying through the 1980s, he built and financed a global network of terrorism that left a trail of destruction across multiple continents. He provided weapons, training, funding, and safe harbor to dozens of militant and insurgent groups. The Irish Republican Army received Libyan-supplied weapons for years. Various Palestinian factions were armed and funded. Rebel movements across sub-Saharan Africa received material support, some of them going on to destabilize entire regions. In Uganda, Gaddafi backed Idi Amin. In Chad, he funded and directly intervened in a prolonged conflict, at one point attempting to annex the northern Chadian region, known as the Ozu Strip, claiming it as Libyan territory. But it was a series of specific calculated attacks on civilian targets that brought Gaddafi's terrorism to global attention. In April 1986, a bomb exploded at La Belle Discothèque in West Berlin, a nightclub known to be popular with American military personnel. 3 people were killed, and more than 200 were injured. American intelligence quickly traced the attack back to Libyan agents. 10 days later, U.S. President Ronald Reagan ordered airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi in direct retaliation. The strikes killed dozens of Libyans, including, according to the Libyan government, Gaddafi's adopted daughter, a claim that has never been independently verified. Gaddafi was undeterred. 2 years later, on December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie at 31,000 feet. All 259 passengers and crew on board were killed. An additional 11 residents of Lockerbie died when wreckage fell on the town. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in British history. After a lengthy international investigation, 2 Libyan intelligence officers were indicted. One was convicted in 2001. The other was acquitted but remained a suspect. Libya eventually accepted formal responsibility for the bombing in 2003 as part of a broader deal to re-enter the international community. and agreed to pay compensation to the families of the victims, though the Libyan government stopped short of a direct admission of guilt. Just 8 months after Lockerbie, in September 1989, UTA Flight 772 was blown out of the sky over Niger, killing all 170 people on board. French investigators traced the bombing back to Libyan intelligence agents. Several individuals with ties to Gaddafi's inner circle were convicted in absentia by a French court. Libya again accepted responsibility years later and agreed to pay compensation. What is striking about these attacks is not just their scale. It is the directness of the connection to the Libyan state. These were not the actions of rogue agents acting without authorization. The evidence that emerged over years of investigation pointed to operations that were planned, coordinated, and executed by Libyan intelligence under a government apparatus that answered directly to Gaddafi. Thousands of lives ended because of decisions made in Tripoli. And in many of those cases, the families of the victims spent years, sometimes decades, fighting just to have the truth formally acknowledged. The international community responded with sanctions through the 1990s, isolating Libya economically and diplomatically. But inside Libya, the regime was adapting, becoming, if anything, more paranoid and more brutal. Because the threat Gaddafi feared most was not coming from outside Libya, it was coming from within. Even Libyans who managed to flee the country were not safe. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Gaddafi oversaw a systematic campaign to track down, intimidate, and in many cases kill Libyan dissidents and political opponents living abroad. He openly referred to these individuals as stray dogs, a term he used publicly in speeches, and made no effort to conceal the fact that his government intended to eliminate them. The program became known internationally as the Physical Liquidation Campaign. Libyan embassies, which Gaddafi had renamed People's Bureaus, were transformed into intelligence outposts. Diplomats were expected to gather information on Libyan expatriates, identify those with anti-government sympathies, and in some cases actively participate in operations against them. Between 1980 and 1987, Amnesty International documented at least 25 killings of Libyan dissidents in foreign countries, including in the United Kingdom, West Germany, Italy, Greece, and across the Middle East. The victims included students, journalists, former officials, and academics. Some were shot, some were found dead in circumstances designed to look accidental or self-inflicted. In many cases, the individuals had been openly critical of the Gaddafi regime and had received explicit threats beforehand. In one of the most audacious incidents, a Libyan dissident in London was targeted through an extraordinary act of violence that drew international condemnation. Yvonne Fletcher, a British police officer, was killed in April 1984 while monitoring a protest outside the Libyan People's Bureau on St. James's Square. Shots were fired from a window inside the embassy, striking Fletcher and injuring several protesters. The shooter was never brought to justice. The Libyan diplomats inside the building claimed diplomatic immunity, and the British government, after a tense standoff, allowed them to leave the country. The killing of a police officer on the streets of London sent a clear message to foreign governments. Gaddafi believed he could act anywhere, against anyone, with impunity, and for a long time, his calculation was essentially correct. Attempts by Western governments to hold Libya accountable were complicated by oil interests, Cold War dynamics, and the difficulty of obtaining formal evidence against a state that had complete control over its own judicial and intelligence apparatus. The dissidents abroad were largely on their own, living in fear, watching their friends and colleagues disappear, never knowing who around them might be reporting back to Tripoli. The psychological dimension of this campaign was deliberate. Gaddafi understood that he did not need to kill every opponent. He needed only to make every opponent believe they could be killed at any moment. Letters arrived at dissidents' homes, warning them to return to Libya or face consequences. Phone calls came in the night. In some cases, family members still inside Libya were arrested as leverage. The campaign was designed not just to eliminate opponents, but to silence anyone who might consider speaking out. To make the cost of dissent feel infinite, regardless of where in the world you had fled to. But what was happening to the people closest to Gaddafi, inside the palace, inside the inner circle, was a different kind of horror entirely. Among the most disturbing and extensively documented aspects of Gaddafi's rule was the way he used women, both as a symbol of his power and as victims of it. For years, Gaddafi surrounded himself with a unit of female bodyguards known as the Amazonian Guard, or more formally, the Revolutionary Nuns. The concept served multiple purposes. It projected an image of gender progressivism, it functioned as a propaganda tool to show that women in Libya were empowered and equal, and it provided Gaddafi with a personal security detail that was, by most accounts, highly trained and deeply loyal. The women were required to take a vow of celibacy and underwent rigorous military training. In the Western media, the Amazonian Guard became one of the most recognized symbols of Gaddafi's eccentricity. He traveled with them internationally, deployed them at public events, and made sure they were visible in press photographs. The image was carefully curated. What the image concealed was documented in detail only after the regime fell in 2011 when survivors came forward. Multiple women who had been part of or in contact with Gaddafi's inner circle gave testimonies to journalists and human rights investigators describing patterns of coercion and assault that dated back decades. Women from across Libya, including students from elite institutions, described being summoned to the compound under various pretexts and then subjected to abuse. A doctor who served in Gaddafi's personal medical staff, Seyham Sergewa, conducted interviews after the fall of the regime and described receiving dozens of testimonies from women who had experienced such treatment. She herself was later abducted in 2019 by a different Libyan faction, a grim reminder of how unstable Libya remained long after Gaddafi's death. One of the most detailed accounts came from a woman identified in international reporting as Soraya, who was allegedly taken from her school at the age of 15 and kept at Gaddafi's compound, where she was subjected to repeated abuse over a period of years. Her account was published in the book Dans les griffes du guide by French journalist Annick Cogent, and it was corroborated by former staff members. The scope of what was described, not isolated incidents, but a systematic pattern, facilitated by staff who procured and coerced women, enforced by the culture of absolute power that surrounded Gaddafi, was deeply disturbing. It pointed to abuse not as a side effect of his rule, but as an expression of it. International human rights organizations noted that Gaddafi's conduct was enabled and concealed by the same apparatus that sustained every other aspect of his tyranny, a culture of silence, enforced through fear, sustained by absolute impunity. What also became clear in the years after 2011 was that this had been an open secret within Tripoli's political and social circles for years. Staff members knew, officials who passed through the compound knew, foreign visitors and diplomats who spent time in Libya during the regime's final decades had, in many cases, heard accounts that they chose not to raise publicly. The silence was not simply a product of fear. It was also a product of the calculated indifference of governments and institutions that had chosen business and oil over accountability. And all of this, the terror, the killings, the international attacks, the abuse, was financed by one of the largest personal fortunes ever accumulated by a single head of state. When Gaddafi's regime collapsed in 2011 and investigators began tracing the flow of money that had kept it running, the scale of what they found was almost incomprehensible. The Libyan Investment Authority, established in 2006 as the country's sovereign wealth fund, was estimated to hold approximately $65 to $70 billion in assets by the time of the uprising. But that figure represented only the institutionalized portion of the state's wealth. Separate investigations by the U.S. government, European authorities, and the United Nations found evidence of vast sums held in hidden accounts, shell companies, and real estate holdings spread across Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. Various estimates placed the total assets under Gaddafi's personal control, including those nominally held by the Libyan state, but functionally at his disposal, at somewhere between $70 and $200 billion. The range is wide because tracing money hidden through decades of sophisticated financial engineering across dozens of jurisdictions is extraordinarily difficult. What is not in doubt is that it was one of the largest concentrations of wealth ever assembled by a single ruling family. The contrast with how ordinary Libyans lived was stark. Despite sitting on Africa's largest proven oil reserves, Libya's population experienced endemic poverty. crumbling infrastructure, and persistent unemployment, particularly in the years before the uprising. The oil money flowed upward and outward. It funded terrorism, bought international silence, financed lavish personal expenditures, and enriched Gaddafi's children and allies. In parts of Tripoli and other major cities, basic services were unreliable. Roads deteriorated, hospitals operated with shortages, housing projects that had been announced with fanfare stalled or were never completed. Meanwhile, the families of the regime's inner circle lived in a manner that bore no relationship to the conditions around them. The disconnect between the public rhetoric of the revolution, which promised wealth and dignity to all Libyans, and the lived reality of most of the population was one of the defining features of life under Gaddafi. His son, Saif al-Islam, was educated at the London School of Economics, where he obtained a doctorate, a credential that later became the subject of a plagiarism investigation. His son, Mu'tasim, held a senior military post and was known for throwing extravagant parties in Europe, once reportedly paying for a private concert by a major international recording artist at enormous expense. His daughter Aisha was appointed as a goodwill ambassador by the United Nations in 2009, a decision that drew widespread criticism and was revoked almost immediately after the 2011 uprising began. Gaddafi himself maintained a series of enormous compounds in Libya, traveled with a retinue of hundreds of staff and bodyguards, and was known for theatrical personal touches, including the large Bedouin tent he brought with him on international visits and erected on the grounds of foreign capitals, which became a recurring spectacle at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. But the money served another purpose beyond personal indulgence. It bought influence in African capitals, in Arab governments, in European political circles, and in international institutions. And when the uprising began in February 2011, it was deployed in an attempt to buy survival. It wasn't enough. By the time the Arab Spring reached Libya in February 2011, the country had been under Gaddafi's control for 42 years. The uprising began in Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city, in mid-February 2011, part of the broader wave of popular revolts that had already toppled governments in Tunisia and Egypt. The initial protests were met with live fire from security forces. Within days, the demonstrations had expanded into an armed rebellion. Entire army units defected to the opposition. Senior government officials resigned publicly. Within a month, rebels controlled significant portions of eastern Libya. Gaddafi's response was to escalate. In a speech on February 22, 2011, just days into the uprising, he promised to hunt down his opponents house by house, alley by alley, in language that prompted the United Nations to pass a resolution authorizing the protection of civilians. NATO launched an air campaign in March 2011, targeting Gaddafi's military assets and preventing his forces from crushing the rebellion. The conflict lasted 8 months. During that time, the fighting was brutal on both sides. Gaddafi's forces laid siege to cities, cut off water and electricity supplies, and were documented using heavy weapons against civilian areas. The city of Misrata in western Libya endured one of the most prolonged sieges, surrounded by regime forces for months. Its residents trapped, while supplies ran low and casualties mounted. Aid organizations described conditions inside the city as catastrophic. The siege of Misrata lasted nearly 3 months before rebel fighters, supported by NATO airstrikes, forced the regime's military back. In August 2011, rebel forces entered Tripoli and the regime collapsed rapidly. Gaddafi fled south. His whereabouts became a subject of intense international interest. Several of his children and close associates were captured or killed in the fighting. His son, Kamis, who had commanded an elite brigade responsible for some of the worst violence against civilians during the uprising, was reportedly killed in August 2011. On October 20th, 2011, Gaddafi was found hiding in a drainage pipe near his hometown of Sirte. He was captured by rebel fighters. What happened next was captured on video and seen around the world. Gaddafi was beaten, abused, and then killed. The circumstances of his death were graphic and have been described in detail elsewhere. The transitional government said he died of wounds sustained during crossfire. Human rights organizations concluded he had been executed without trial. He was 69 years old. The regime he had built over 4 decades collapsed within hours of his capture. The prisons were opened. the secret police apparatus was dismantled, or rather, its members scattered and in many cases reconstituted themselves in the factional militias that would go on to fight over Libya's future. The country he left behind was fractured in ways that persist to this day. Libya, in the years after 2011, did not become the free and stable nation that many had hoped the uprising would produce. The fall of Gaddafi removed a tyrant, but also removed the single organizing structure that had held the country together, however violently, for 4 decades. In the absence of functioning institutions, rival militias and political factions filled the vacuum. The country split between competing governments, each backed by different foreign powers and different armed groups. Oil infrastructure became a bargaining chip in a prolonged civil war. Migrant detention centers, some of them operating in conditions that United Nations investigators described in deeply disturbing terms, became an international scandal. Some of the men who had run Gaddafi's security apparatus continued to operate, now wearing different flags. Abu Salim prison, the site of the 1996 massacre, was repurposed by various factions after 2011. The families of those killed there are still waiting for full accountability. The International Criminal Court had issued arrest warrants for Gaddafi and his son, Saif al-Islam, before his death. Saif was captured in 2011 and held by a militia in the town of Zintan for years. He was tried by a Libyan court in absentia and sentenced to death, though the sentence was never carried out. He was eventually released in 2017 and has since positioned himself as a potential political figure in Libya's ongoing crisis, a prospect that has provoked deep anger among survivors of his father's regime and the families of its victims. The question of full accountability for what happened under Gaddafi's rule, not just his death, but the decades of documented atrocities, remains unresolved. The 1,200 people killed at Abu Salim in 1996 have still not been fully accounted for. The families of the Lockerbie victims spent years fighting for acknowledgement. The Libyan women who came forward after 2011 to describe what happened to them inside the regime's compounds received little institutional support. The dissidents killed abroad were, in most cases, never the subject of criminal proceedings. Part of what makes accountability so difficult is the sheer scale of what the regime did, and the degree to which its crimes were distributed across decades, across borders, and across different categories of harm. There is no single institution, no single court, no single process that can address all of it simultaneously. Lockerbie families pursued justice through Scottish courts, through the United Nations, through direct negotiations with the Libyan government, and even after Libya paid compensation and accepted formal responsibility, many felt that the full truth of what had been ordered and by whom was never completely established. For Libyans who survived the domestic terror of the regime, the prisons, the disappearances, the systematic violence, the path to justice has been even harder. The collapse of the state in 2011 did not produce stable institutions capable of conducting investigations or delivering trials. It produced chaos in which many of the perpetrators simply changed sides, changed uniforms, or moved to different parts of the country. This is the other part of Gaddafi's legacy. Not just what he did, but how much of it remained unacknowledged, uncompensated, and unpunished. Over 4 decades, one man and the system he built caused a documented, traceable trail of suffering that touched Libyans inside their country, Libyans outside it, and people of many other nationalities who had the misfortune to cross paths with his ambitions. The scale of it, taken together, is difficult to fully absorb, but the families of his victims have never stopped trying to ensure that it is not forgotten. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.